It's rare that any plant is solely pollinated by one animal or insect. Some plants will gradually evolve from one pollinator to another. I've photographed plants that produce bright red flowers that we normally associate with bird pollination, and you can see that they've been shifting over so that now they open up while it's still light enough for a hummingbird to come, but most of the nectar is produced after dark and is eaten by bats. So they're relying more and more on bats, but they were originally bird pollinated.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the show today. And this week, it is Bat Week here on the Epic Gardening Podcast. We have Dr. Merlin Tuttle on the show, widely recognized as the father of modern bat conservation. And he's an ecologist, a wildlife photographer, and a conservationist who studied bats and championed their preservation for over 60 years and is the founder of Merlin Tuttle's Bat Conservation. And he's joined by Teresa Nikta, who is the outreach and collection manager at Merlin Tuttle's Bat Conservation. So thank you both so much for coming on the show. I'm really excited to talk about bats with you both.
Thanks, Kevin. Happy to
Thank
be here.
you.
From the gardener's perspective, I'll confess here in San Diego, at least, I think I maybe have seen a bat once or twice. I don't know if my eyes were deceiving me or not. And as we go on through the week, I'll share that I do have a bat house on the property, though I'm almost positive I haven't set it up correctly. But maybe we could start with, Merlin, just your background. I mean, you've been doing this for such a long time. I'm curious how it all started for you.
Well, I've been studying bats for almost 65 years. I've photographed or studied them in 45 countries, spent hundreds of hours in caves surrounded by thousands, sometimes even millions of bats. If bats were a threat to people, I would certainly know about it by now. I've never been attacked. I've never contracted a disease from a bat. All people have to do to live safely and very productively with bats is to just leave them alone, let them do their thing, and not try to handle them, but benefit from their services.
Where do you think the mythology, I suppose, of bats being harmful, is it all from, Dracula and vampire type of mythology?
We're all just naturally most fearful of the things we understand least. And bats have the misfortune of working the night shift. If you, for example, are walking home after working a night shift, you're much more likely to be distrusted, turned into the police by your neighbors.
Yeah, makes sense. What was it about bats for you, I guess, that has kept you so captivated by them over the last 60 years?
Well, they're incredibly diverse. They're amazingly sophisticated. They have social systems strikingly similar to our own. There are more than 1,400 species. They adopt orphans. They share information. They're incredibly important to healthy ecosystems and human economies.
When we talk about, most of us listening we're gardeners by trade, and we're looking for ways to control pests. Obviously, there's some human ways you can do that, but the more you can build an ecology or an ecosystem, even just in a backyard garden, at least from my perspective, the better. And so I don't really know much about how bats play a part of that, pest control or maybe feeding ecosystem at night and maybe just a backyard garden. What can you share there?
Bats have an incredible role to play in control of nocturnal flying pests. They have impact on almost every kind of pest you can think of, everything from moths and beetles to stink bugs to plant hoppers to just mosquitoes, almost anything you can think of. They're helping keep them in balance.
When do they start that, I guess, feeding cycle? I guess like as dusk approaches and then throughout the entire night, are they taking care of pests?
The majority of insect activity occurs in the first 3 hours of night, so that's when the bats are the most likely, most insect-eating bats are the most active, and then they tend to be active again toward dawn as there's another peak in insect activity. But they eat huge numbers of insects. We have a colony under our Congress Avenue Bridge in Austin that consumes tons of insect pests every night, and a cave not far from here, Bracken Cave, it's 10 to 20 million bats, eat more than 100 tons of insects nightly, and a large proportion of those are pests. We'd be buried in insects we don't want to associate with if it wasn't for bats.
That is wild. Yeah, I mean, usually when people say tons, they're using it as a colloquialism, but in this case, we're talking literal 2,000-pound tons worth of insects.
That's
when you're mentioning that.
I usually like to add that literal right in there because people think that exactly.
Yeah. To me, I've transitioned, at least in my garden, to mostly not really spraying any kind of pesticides or herbicides or fungicides or anything like that. But, for beginner gardeners or someone who's in their backyard just kind of trying to take care of weeds and stuff, is there anything that would disrupt the ability of a bat to do the job for them, basically?
Well, the more pesticides you're using in your yard, the less there is for bats to eat that is safe to eat. It certainly helps if you preserve as much native vegetation as you can. Bats don't just protect farms and gardens. Crops are harvested, and in between crops, there's nothing for a bat to eat if there's no biodiversity. That's why oftentimes when people put up bat houses near rivers, they do better, because we normally leave diverse vegetation along rivers in what we call riparian habitats, and they produce insects that the bats can maintain themselves with in between times when we really need them, like cucumber beetles or cordierworm moths. These are only there during certain parts of the year, and the bats have to have something to eat during the rest of the year.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess it would be similar. I was talking once with someone who did a documentary on pollinators in general, but it was mostly about bees, and it was about the managed honeybee industry, which I didn't know was a thing until I spoke with him, and he was saying something somewhat similar, where they've in these orchards or these nut fields, they've basically removed all the native vegetation to the point where there is nothing left for bees to forage on except for the orchard crop, which of course is not in season all year long. And so it's created an industry where they've had to bring in honeybees from elsewhere because they've ruined the ability of the ecosystem to actually do it itself. And it sounds like the same thing is kind of in play for bats.
There are places in the world where they actually give incentives for farmers to leave rows of flowering plants in between, say, orchards of nuts or something else, so that they do maintain bees and wasps that are needed for pollination and for pest control.
Yeah, I mean, as a gardener too, what we often recommend is when fall comes, just leave the vegetation on the ground. Don't clean the whole garden up completely. Not only for bats, I guess, but also just for the insect life that is going to reproduce and eventually just feed them.
Yeah.
So it makes total sense. It's a twist though, and I think what a lot of us grew up doing, I can speak for myself, growing up as like a suburban kid, it's seen as messy to do something like that, and it's just not in the culture, I suppose. And as you kind of unprogram that, you realize actually that's what we should be doing.
Yes, I know of situations in which people have actually been sued for not keeping well-maintained mowed lawns. If a real native plant crops up in your yard, your neighbors think there's something wrong with you. You're not maintaining your yard well.
Yeah.
You should tell them about your garden. Oh, it just happened?
It just happened to my brother. He just bought a house in Santa Ana area, and he just got from the Santa Ana municipality. They send him a fine for not mowing his yard, but his backyard is full of native native plants, maybe some non-native stuff, but regardless, better than a completely sterile dirt lot, obviously, but not to the city.
Well, he's probably helping make the neighborhood safer because, for example, bats do eat, in fact, a lot more mosquitoes than we originally thought they did.
Mm-hmm.
The bats that are eating mosquitoes have to have something else to eat when there aren't mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are very patchy in time. It rains and there's puddle seed around at a certain time, and then there's a big explosion of mosquitoes. If the bats haven't had anything else to eat in the interim, they're not going to be present when you need them to attack the new hatch of mosquitoes.
Or they would decide like the area is not a safe place to live because it's not reliable There's not food around.
They'd find a better spot that's a little bit more consistent.
Sure.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I was saying you should tell them about your garden that you won an award for.
Oh.
Well, it wasn't exactly a garden, but years ago I planted native plants actually in a way that was very winsome. So I got an award for it, but I had 20-some species of native grass and 50-some species of native flowers. And I came home one evening to find people out photographing my yard. I didn't know what they were doing. I asked them, and it turned out that I was about to get the first place award for Austin for native yard.
No way. So someone put you in for the award without you knowing.
Right.
Yeah, that's amazing.
But as an ecologist, I see tremendous benefits in maintaining biodiversity. Bats that protect crops can't do it if we don't leave them anything else to survive on in between. For example, there's a study published a few years ago in the Mediterranean where scientists put up bat houses strategically located around rice crops. And they ended up, over a period of years, reducing the moths that attack rice there sufficiently that they didn't need to use pesticides anymore. But they point out very strongly in their paper, had there not been a national park not far away where the bats could go and feed in the off season, their experiment wouldn't have worked, because once the rice was harvested, what would happen to the bats? They wouldn't have any food.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it makes total sense when you put it that way, but I think, especially from, coming from a gardener's perspective, as you gain years and years of experience doing it, you start to see the patterns, but it can be hard in the first couple of years of growing to put all that stuff together, which is why it's great to have someone like you on. I just have a random question about bats. Maybe it's a too simple question, but is there an area, let's say of the United States, where there are no native bat species in that particular area, or are they ever present throughout the USA?
Bats are found just about everywhere where there are humans, but there are particular areas where you'd have to look long and hard to find a bat because there's nothing for them to eat or no place to live.
We talked about bats as a way to control pests, I suppose, but really more broadly about their role in the ecosystem. And something that I've learned a lot in the garden is just building biodiversity builds the entire ecosystem, or at least the backyard ecosystem in my case. And, let's say you're listening and you really do want to attract bats. What could you start to do to even give yourself a chance if you're just a backyard grower?
Well, it certainly helps to protect native plants. That's not necessarily going to sit well with your neighbors, but the more native plants you have in your yard, the more you're contributing to keeping nature healthy.
Merlin, when you won the award for the native plant garden in Austin, had you planted that in a way that was, I don't know, say like an aesthetic native garden, or did you just sort of plant it in a way that maybe neighbors would be a little upset by seeing?
Actually, I worked really hard at it.
Yeah.
I'm not going to claim that it was easy the way I did it, but I had things that flowered in succession, and I would go in and trim one set while the next one was coming on. I managed it, but it was all native plants, and it was beautiful, so I got an award.
Yeah.
Had I just let a wide variety of what people would consider weeds grow up, I'm sure I'd have had a different reaction. But even weeds, if they're native, are better than planting sod and other things that are non-native that don't help produce food for wildlife, particularly bats.
Yeah. Yeah. And how do bats, let's say, I've done enough work that bats have now decided my place is a good place to spend some time. How do they impact the biodiversity of the ecosystem once they actually do show up?
Well, they keep things in balance. In the United States, we have almost exclusively bats that eat insects. But in other parts of the world, they do much, much more to contribute to biodiversity, pollinating flowers and dispersing seeds and doing other things that are important to human economies and ecosystems. But our bats, once we provide, we have to do more than just provide biodiversity. They have to have places to live. Our U.S. bats have lost huge numbers of their original traditional roosts in caves or in ancient tree hollows. There are very few of the old trees and snags left. When we see a snag, we cut it down before it falls on somebody. We don't leave it up hoping that bats might use it. And the biggest, best caves for bats have been taken over by people typically. And so they don't have places to live. That's one of the reasons why we promote bat houses, is so that bats will have a place to live in addition to providing diverse habitat that provides them with food.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess to me, that sort of reminds me of what I was saying yesterday about leaving the garden debris at the end of the season on like a forest scale, leaving the snags there instead of cutting them down immediately seems to make sense. But I guess then you'd have to convince whoever's managing that area to do that, right? Because they're doing it, I guess, supposedly for human safety to remove the snag, right?
Years ago, we ran into a real conundrum. The Forest Service was mandating that a certain number of snags be saved to preserve bat habitat, and OSHA was requiring that the snags be cut as hazards to people.
Yeah. That's a catch-22, I guess, right?
Yeah.
What can someone do landscape-wise? Are there particular types of trees or plant, not necessarily to the species, but like particular styles of trees or plantings that would be more likely to attract bats?
Well, you certainly want native species. Our exotics that we bring in so many of don't provide food for insects that bats can eat. We often think of insects as all bad, and if we plant a plant that helps increase the number of insects, we look at that as a really bad thing. But we ourselves probably couldn't survive for maybe not even a month if all of a sudden all the world's insects died. We depend on insects, and most of them are highly beneficial. It's when we disrupt the environment, create monocultures where predators of insects can't live, that we suddenly end up with too many of the wrong kinds of insects in the wrong places, threatening our future.
Yeah, it was interesting when I first moved into my home, it's really a suburban home in San Diego, but when I moved in, it was a third of an acre they had cut all the sod out and they just put on some native, well, not even native, just undyed wood chips. I don't even know what type of wood it was. So there was nothing on the land at all, to the point that you've been saying, Merlin, about, there's no biodiversity at all, no plants, maybe one or two non-native trees. So those trees came down, and over the course of the last couple of years, I've seen different insect populations rise and fall in their concentration, I suppose. So year one, earwigs; year two, more of these pill bugs. And then as the plants came in, both native and of course some annual veggies, because I'm a gardener, and some fruit trees, seeing that start to balance itself. No bats yet, but seeing the bird species come in, and some of the mammals that are coming in and digging through the soil. It's been really cool to see that all actually happen in real time, although it's taken years, but you do notice over the seasons that ecological change.
Yeah, there is no greater threat to life on Earth than extensive monocultures.
Yep.
We turn natural forests into basic farms where we plant mostly pine or some other harvestable kind of tree. Even worse, we often bring in eucalyptus or something else that's not supposed to be here, and nothing can eat it or live in it. And so we really threaten the balance of nature. Bats have enormous impact economically that we seldom hear about. About 70% of the fruits that we depend on from the tropics are bat dependent for pollination or seed dispersal. Bats contribute 90-some% of the first seeds that fall on cleared land to enable reforestation in tropical and subtropical areas. Many of the world's most valuable, economically valuable plants depend on bats. We might not have bananas if it wasn't for bats that were their original pollinators. Where would we be without our margaritas? All tequila comes from a single agave species that is highly dependent upon bats for pollination. Even the giant baobab that's famous in East Africa produces $1 billion worth of fruit that people sell for vitamins. There are just an endless array of plants that contribute to biodiversity that we could lose without bats to pollinate or disperse their seeds. And in addition, there was a study recently published right here in the United States where they put netting over large areas up high so the bats couldn't get in to control the insects inside the netted off area. And they found that hickory seedlings had 400% more damage than those outside where the bats could control the insects.
I couldn't have imagined that study taking place. I guess it seems like quite an undertaking to net that much space, but I guess the proof's in the results, just that they can't access it, and there you go. You see the effect. I know we're going to talk about how to get some bats, or hopefully get a chance to get some bats into perhaps someone's backyard garden. I was reached out to by a company. I think it's called the Bat B&B. Have you guys heard of that product before?
Oh, yeah.
First of all, what do you think? Is it a good one or not?
I helped them design their bat house.
All right. I'm Merlin Tuttle. I'm already Merlin Tuttle approved. I mean, this is a good start for me. But
we certify houses that if you're going to buy a bat house, you ought to take a look and see if it's been certified. Because yes.
Yeah.
A lot of the bat houses are for sale. Someone is just competing for who can sell the most for the least money, but many of those aren't any good. We certify good bat houses. If it's got our seal of approval, then it meets certain basic standards that you need to be aware of.
That B&B does.
Yeah.
Hey, there we go. Okay, so I'm off to a good start, but this is where I think I probably have gone wrong. So I don't have very many trees at a specific height. There's nothing anymore on the property that's over maybe 10 or 15 feet or so. So I tried to find the highest spot on my property, which ended up being my garden shed. And I put it on the back of my garden shed, which is really kind of not very visible. I don't know how much that matters, but it's up against the side of my property next to my neighbor's property. And I popped the Bat B&B up in the rafters there, and just, I don't even know what's happened to it since. I peek every so often. But I even remember on the product, it said it could take up to 2 years for bats to find a home. And so I don't know, did I do something wrong here as far as my setup goes?
No. Now, depending on where you live, I'd want to know what color the bat house was and what direction it faced, so I knew how much sun it got.
So I'm south facing. It would be south facing, and it's the natural sort of, I don't know, like a light brown wood type. I don't think it's painted of any kind.
Sounds fine to me.
Okay. So I'm set up then. Does it need to be higher than 10 feet or so, or?
Ideally, but it depends on the kind of bat you're attracting in that area. Free-tailed bats have long, narrow wings. They're kind of the jets of the bat world. They go up thousands of feet above ground at night, sometimes ride tailwinds at 100 miles an hour. They like longer drop space, maybe from 15 to 20 feet up. But there are plenty of other bats that use bat houses that are fine with a house 10 feet above ground.
And how close is it to your neighbor's house, or is it close to any trees or anything?
It's pretty close to my neighbor's house. There's like the shed's right up against my fence, which is smaller than 10 feet, but it would be right next to, like, if you were sitting in the bat house and looking out, you'd just be looking over my neighbor's backyard.
Well, there's not a problem as long as you're not sitting where predators, owls, can perch nearby and grab bats going in. That's why we tell people to try to keep bat houses at least 20 feet from the nearest trees or other perches where owls or hawks could wait to catch bats.
To snag them. Yeah. My other idea, and I don't even know if this is legal, but I have over the ground power lines in my area. And so my backyard just happens to be one with an actual electric pole, like a wooden electric pole. And I thought, what if I just got a big ladder and mounted it halfway up the electric pole? It'd be taller at least, but it'd be kind of near a tree. So maybe that wouldn't be a good idea, I guess.
That might not be good if it's too near a tree.
Okay.
Wires too can sometimes be like purchased for birds of prey.
Right. Yeah, there's a ton of birds. I know there's definitely like a family of hawks that is around the house as well that kind of circles sometimes. So maybe that wouldn't be a good idea.
But 2 years isn't. We've been doing very well with some of the most recent designs that we've developed. Actually, those designs are in my bat house guide that we produced about a year ago. These new designs, at least here in this area, are proving almost 100% successful in attracting bats within 4 to 12 months. But you can't really count on getting bats right away. However, we've documented more than one instance in this area where bats, even as many as 100, moved in within the first week. I just got a report on a house we put up at a nature center near Austin. It was empty for almost 2 years, and then all of a sudden they said they can't count all the bats. It's more than 100 bats coming out of it.
Wow. That's the dream. That's what I'm hoping for. I don't know how many would fit in my bat B&B, but
I even know of 2 houses here in Austin that are said to have been vacant for 20 years and then filled up. I would think I'd get a bit discouraged before 20 years was up, but
yeah, I would too.
It's very common to have bats move in within 12 to 18 months.
And is it just a function of having the house there, or I know we talked about biodiversity, et cetera. Let's assume I've done as much as I can do in my backyard as far as adding native plants, native shrubs and trees. Is there anything else I can do to try to attract them besides just do that and have the bat house?
Not a whole lot. You're more likely to succeed if you put up 2 or more houses in the same area. Bats are used to living in snags that often fall down during storms. So they like to find a home where there's an alternative close by in case something goes wrong. So that really helps. And it also, nothing you can do to move a river, but the closer you live to a river, the better. And I think that's more than just the need for water. It's probably also the need for an abundant and diverse insect supply.
That I'm excited to say I do have, I think it's a 1,500 gallon pond in the backyard. And so I was like, okay, there's some different insects that are around now. Maybe this is going to help. I still haven't seen the bats, but I don't know, fingers crossed. We'll have to see. If someone was going to make a bat house, first of all, I guess, would you recommend a DIY? And if so, like what are some, in the bat house guide is perfect. But what are the must-haves in a bat house design?
Well, it should be, I would like to see, now there's no absolutes, but I would like to see a good bat house that is at least 24 inches tall and probably has a slit across the front down maybe 4 inches from the bottom, 5 inches from the bottom, that's a vent. And what this does is when the sun shines on that house, it can be literally 100 and some degrees up in the top and 30 degrees less down at the bottom below the vent. So you're trying to achieve a wide range of temperature so that they can move their pups on a cool day up to where it's warmer, on a hot day down where they escape the heat. Also, the surfaces, especially inside, need to be rough so that they can cling to them. The roosting spaces shouldn't be more than 3/4 to an inch wide. There should be a landing area of at least 6 inches sticking below the entry so they have something rough to land on and scamper inside quickly. And placement is certainly important. I like to put pairs on a pole, one house facing southeast and the other northwest. That gives bats diverse temperature because the sun hits the southeast one predominantly, while the northwest one will be predominantly shaded, and the bats can move back and forth as they need to as an additional adjustment for temperature.
This book is not only about bat houses and like beautiful pictures of bats, but it literally has to build your own bat house designs and plans, and tells you who, where, what bat house would go where for like where you live, and different styles. So this is like well over 30 years of comprehensive information that Merlin's gathered through his experience and studies. So it's a cool book if you like bats and are just curious, because there's all these beautiful pictures in it too. But
there you go.
It's also
Wait, did you take those, Teresa?
Merlin.
You took those, Merlin. Nice.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm getting a copy, 100%, and I'll put it in the podcast description. So let's go to maybe the home garden first. If I'm growing, a backyard garden full of maybe annual vegetables, maybe some annual fruits, like maybe a strawberry, and then maybe I've got a couple fruit trees. How much of an impact do bats play to pollination in just someone's backyard garden?
Unfortunately, not much if you live in the United States, because most pollinating bats live in tropical or semi-tropical areas. But once you move out of the temperate zone into the tropics, bats can play a very big role. In fact, many of the world's most economically important plants are heavily reliant on bats for pollination. We probably wouldn't have bananas today if it wasn't for bats. Bats are key pollinators of the original ancestral bananas. We wouldn't have tequila for our margaritas. There are numerous economically important plants. About 70% of the tropical fruits that we come to appreciate in the marketplace are pollinated or seed dispersed by bats. That even gets down to peaches. They're not pollinated, but they're seed dispersed by bats originally.
If we go to the tequila example, we go to the agave plant that you mentioned in the prior episode, can you explain for folks listening how the bat actually pollinates that plant? Like, what's the mechanism that's going on there?
Well, the plant doesn't open its flowers ready for pollination until about sundown. And at that point, there's a thin skin that pops open, and the female part of the flower then becomes sticky, and the anthers do the same thing, split a thin covering that starts to release a powdery substance we call pollen that then gets transferred to the stigma, the female part. And as these bats fly from plant to plant, they get covered in pollen. Their faces and wings get pollen on them, and that's transferred to the next flower. But in the mornings, we see large numbers of hummingbirds and bees and wasps visiting flowers. They're getting the leftovers. By the time they're visiting, most of those flowers have already been pollinated and are no longer in need of their services or even available. They're the substance that stuck the pollen to the stigma is dried up.
Right.
And also, those flowers don't even grow. These are like century plants. So it's a really big deal to check what producers are bat friendly, which are, allowing their products to grow flowers. Because you can probably speak more clearly to that. But Merlin's saying these flowers don't open until the night, but they don't even grow the flowers until later on. So it's a very, very long process of
I left out one of the world's most lucrative plant products. If you lived in Southeast Asia, you've ever visited there, you've probably heard of the durian. Quite the famous fruit. It sells for billions of dollars a year, and its flowers open after dark, are pollinated by bats, and then as soon as the bat one tree can have hundreds of flowers open in a single night. And as soon as the bat pollinates a flower, it drops the anthers and petals to the ground. That signifies that this flower has already been visited. So the next bat that comes doesn't waste time on a flower that's already pollinated. It goes to the next flower. But unfortunately, illustrative of how badly we misunderstand bats, the growers very frequently will see those petals dropping to the ground and think that the bats are destroying their crop. And so they actually put up nets and do things to kill the bats, killing large numbers of the bats that are absolutely essential for producing their crop. But they think they're saving their crop when they're killing their best friends.
It's wild how off we can be about what's actually doing what in nature sometimes. And to your point, Teresa, about the agave, it's growing up in San Diego, there's a bunch of it around here. And so every so often you'll see that one stalk come up and you go, okay, well, that's its final hurrah. And hopefully some bats hit those around here. But yeah, we track that kind of just for fun as gardeners kind of driving around the city because you see it all over the place.
They also have pictures of all that. I'll send you the link. We also have a film that we made about bat pollinating agave.
That'd be really cool to see. Yeah, that'd be really cool to see. And you were saying, Teresa, that if you're buying tequila, make sure that the producer's bat friendly. Is this something you can actually check?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, got it. That makes total sense. Merlin, are there plants that without bats? I know you mentioned bananas, etc., but are there other plants that bats are the sole pollinator of?
It's rare that any plant is solely pollinated by one animal or insect, but there are certainly plenty of plants that are extremely dependent and might die out without their pollinators. Some plants will gradually evolve from one pollinator to another. I've photographed plants that produce bright red flowers that we normally associate with bird pollination, and they're actually bat pollinated. And you can see that they've been shifting over so that now they open up while it's still light enough for a hummingbird to come, but most of the nectar is produced after dark and is eaten by bats. So they're relying more and more on bats, but they were originally bird pollinated.
Interesting.
I also like what helped me understand it is like with the agave example, aside from the nocturnal versus daytime, but the bees are so small and they eat, whatever small amounts, for the agave that has these huge panicles, like tons of flowers, they could just go around like this and then eat enough. But bats need to eat so much, they fly from plant to plant and they visit so many more and they fly long distances. So they're pollinating across a bigger
their span is much.
What's really happening, the bees are taking pollen back to the beehive, but a bee can get all the pollen it can carry from one plant, and they rarely fly very far to get back to their hive. Whereas, for example, the lesser long-nosed bats that visit these same plants may fly 60 kilometers in a night, so they carry far more pollen far further than any other pollinated animal.
Yeah, that's interesting when you put it that way, because then you think, their ability to just cross different plants is much greater than the bees, of course, because like you said, bees are going to get all their pollen from one plant and head on back, whereas the bats can't even get close to as much as they need off of one, right?
Actually, the world's biggest cacti are heavily reliant on bats for pollination. The cardone found in Baja California and in northwest Mexico gets up to 50 or 60 feet tall. It's critical habitat for a lot of other animals. It's extremely dependent upon bats for pollination. The saguaro is heavily bat pollinated. The organ pipe is heavily bat pollinated. There are actually hundreds of species of agave and cactus plants between Arizona and Chile that rely predominantly on bats for pollination, and some of them for pollination and seed dispersal both.
That's fascinating.
You also said that bats like cross. You use the word like cross, and that made me think about how there's different plants that have adapted to get bats to be their pollinators. And Merlin, you could probably say it better, but how one bat could carry pollen from different plants on all these different body parts because of the way. Do you want to tell that part?
Oh, interesting.
What Teresa is alluding to, at one time in one place in Costa Rica, I was photographing bats pollinating flowers for National Geographic, and I was incredibly fascinated by how clever the plants were. They don't want to mix pollen between one species and another species because that can result in the same as breeding a horse and a donkey, and you get a mule that's sterile.
Right.
So these clever plants all blooming the same time, the same general area. One of them, for example, puts the pollen on top of the bat's nose. One puts it on his throat. One puts it on the bat's head. One puts it on it between his shoulders. One puts it on the wings, and there's one that even fires pollen so that it hits way down on the rump.
And that's just due to the structure of the flower itself and how the bat has to access the flower, right?
And those flowers are really dependent. In fact, one of them, the mucuna of Latin America, is it is so adapted for bats. It hangs down on a stem that's 3 or 4 feet long, and that stem keeps terrestrial climbing pollinators away from it. It doesn't open until about 45 minutes after the sun goes down, so hummingbirds and diurnal insects can't get to it. And even at night, if you want to pollinate, you got to be real clever. Each flower, when it's ready, puts one petal up that works like a flag to say, okay, I'm ready to be pollinated. Then as the bat approaches, it has to put its tongue into a 2 millimeter slit, just like putting a key into a keyhole in a door. And when the tongue goes in there, he probably couldn't find that slit, except that first petal that goes up acts as a reflector and reflects the bat's echolocation, guiding him like airport landing lights on a runway.
Wow.
And then as his tongue goes in that slot, it releases a trigger mechanism and fires, literally physically fires pollen onto the bat's rump. Now, that's a plant that might very well go extinct.
Yeah, no kidding.
Without bat.
That is absolutely wild. I was going to say that's so customized for that particular interaction that, if that bat decides to not be there for some reason or another, probably human intervention, then that plant might not be as well. Fascinating. In your 60 years of study, you've never been attacked, never gotten a disease from bats, and it just sounds like there's a lot of misconceptions that the general public has about bats, and maybe we could start with this whole idea of being bitten or attacked by them.
The truth is we just fear naturally what we understand least, and unfortunately we generally don't understand much about bats. Most of them have never even been studied beyond giving them a name. We see them darting around unpredictably in the night, which tends to make them look a bit scary to begin with. They have probably one of, if not the finest track record historically of any animal in not transmitting disease to humans. It is exceedingly rare to get any disease from a bat. And for anyone who just doesn't pick up a bat, and if you can pick up a bat, that means it's sick. It's smart enough to get away from you if it's not sick.
Mm-hmm.
But if you pick up a bat and get bitten by it, and then are foolish enough not to have that checked out, I mean, you can still get vaccinated if need be for rabies, have the bat tested. There's just no excuse for getting even rabies from a bat. And there are only 1 to 2 cases per year out of hundreds of millions in all the U.S. and Canada combined that get any disease from a bat.
It feels like it would be way easier to get rabies from almost any other mammal than a bat, right?
Well, I point out I love dogs and cats. I've had my own dogs. But you know what? Dogs kill more Americans annually in outright attacks than have been proven to be killed by bat disease worldwide in all recorded history.
Yeah. It reminds me of the whole, you hear more about someone who dies from a lightning strike than a car accident, right? But clearly one of those is far more common than the other. And I think maybe it's the unfamiliarity folks have with bats. And like you said, it's a nighttime, it's a nocturnal animal. We're naturally a bit more afraid of everything that happens at night, I think, as human beings, and perhaps doesn't help that there's a whole, mythology around Dracula and vampires and stuff that probably contributes to all of this, right?
Well, all these vampire stories originated based on horrible things that people did long before real vampire bats were discovered in Latin America.
Yeah.
Vampire bats also only live in Latin America, to be clear.
Forever. I'm sure it gets, you probably have to clear that up quite often. What do the vampire bats actually feed on, though? Is it like a larger mammal, or?
Well, there are three kinds of vampire bats. There used to be more. In fact, they used to live in the United States all the way up to Kentucky and Virginia. It's too cool up here for them to live here now. But they're really cool animals. 2 out of the 3 species feed only on bird blood, so they don't really come into much conflict with humans. But even the common vampire that will... you're only going to be bitten by a common vampire if you go out into a tropical, Latin American tropical area and are foolish enough to try to go to sleep at night without a mosquito net.
Yeah. You kind of have to ask for that experience, I feel like.
Vampires themselves are incredible. They're very, very intelligent. They share information. They help others in need at risk to their own lives. They adopt orphans. And bats also, for their size, are the longest lived animals on the planet. They can live 40 years or more in the wild, and they're far more resistant. They almost never contract arthritis or cancer, for example. There's a lot we could learn from bats about how to live longer and stay healthier if we simply would get over trying to make money for research by scaring people into the idea that if they don't give you money quick for studying bat disease, that you're going to die of some horrible disease from it.
There's a lot of misdirected resources that could be helping us live a healthier vista.
Yeah. I can imagine the last few years probably weren't the best for bat perception in the world.
It was difficult, but it did give us a lot of opportunity to talk with people and educate people and share the truth about bats.
Are there any other common beliefs that people hold about bats that just simply aren't true?
Well, we finally got most people over the notion that bats are going to entangle in your hair. I didn't lose my hair to bat entanglements. I was an old man.
So that's not a thing either. It makes sense that they wouldn't because of their ability to, echolocate and navigate the world. Like, why would they run into someone's hair and get caught on purpose, so to speak?
I one time had a young lady come up to me after a lecture and tell me that, although I'd said bats didn't get tangled in people's hair, that she'd had an experience where one had been tangled in her hair so badly that her mother had to cut it out with scissors.
Oh, wow.
So I offered to let her come down to my office, and I would bet her, I don't remember the exact amount, I think it was $25 or something. I'd bet her that we couldn't tangle a bat in her hair. So first I set a bat on top. She had a lot of long hair, set the bat on top. It flew off. I caught it, brought it back, lifted up some hair, stuck it underneath, and it popped out like a cork out of water.
That's so funny.
She was studying to be a veterinarian, and she thanked me profusely. She said, I don't know how in the world little kids get these things in their minds and think they're true, but I'm sure happy that as a veterinarian, you saved me from terrible embarrassment of telling people something that's obviously not true.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like there's a lot of stuff like that when you grow up as a kid, that just a myth or something that sticks in your head and you never get it corrected, and you think that a bat's going to get tangled in your hair. I mean, Teresa, you've probably been around bats quite a bit. You have a full head of hair. I feel like you're doing okay.
I'm doing great. It's great fun, and never felt unsafe and never had any problems with my hair.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you guys both for coming on. It's been fascinating learning about bats. Where can people connect more with both of you and the work that you guys do?
On our website, merlintuttle.org.
Okay.
You can learn all about who we are, our team, what we do, the resources that we offer worldwide. We are working hard to preserve Merlin's unparalleled life legacy of bat conservation and photography and conservation philosophy of winning friends, not battles. And so we use that to help other people do the same in their communities.
If you want to know a lot more about my life stories working with bats, along with learning about the bats themselves, you might want to get my book, The Secret World of Bats, My Adventures in Studying the World's Least Understood Mammals.
Secret Lives of Bats.
Okay, I never can remember the same.
Secret World of Bats was a film that Merlin did in the 90s, which I think you can still watch on YouTube.
Oh, no way. Okay.
And it's brilliant. He and Dieter Plaga, who was the best documentary filmmaker at that time, traveled the world and
oh wow, amazing.
Merlin training bats. It's all over the world. It's amazing. Yeah.
Oh wow.
Secret Lives of Bats is the book, and that's also linked on our website. And you can join as a member to get our updates and everything. We have tons of resources, tons of photos. Our Merlin's photo collection is over 100,000 photos that we are working on getting all up to date and shared on our website. So those are uploaded as we get through them, and you can download them too, so you can share them and teach other people about bats.
And bats really do need help. They are now listed officially as the most endangered animals in America.
Oh wow, I had no idea. Wow. Well, hopefully we can put some more attention on them, and hopefully I can get a few in my backyard and see what I can do to give them some help as well. Well, thank you guys both so much for coming on. It's been super informative. I appreciate it.
Thank you
for having it.